Hi Summerleas, hope your week is going well. One of the things we want to encourage throughout our Citizen Church series is a chance to interact and reflect more on the topics that we'll be speaking on over the 3 weeks. And they're pretty massive and complicated, and understandably many people still have questions and things that they want to think through. Thanks so much to those who passed on words of encouragement and offered feedback and asked super interesting questions through the week. It makes a huge difference knowing that people are engaged and thinking deeply about the topics that we're looking into at the moment. Today I'm going to briefly share some resources that I found helpful in my preparation for last week's talk on politics. So if you'd like to do some further reading on the topic, you can hear some of my recommendations in a moment. I'll also be responding to some questions that came up through the week in the second part of this video. But for now, let's turn to the resources. Now, I have 3 books in particular that I want to plug, and I'll give a brief overview of each one now. And the first one is a handy little book called God and Politics by Mark Dever. For those that don't know Mark Dever, he was one of the founding members of the Gospel Coalition and is a pastor of Capitol Hill Baptist Church in the heart of Washington, D.C. He has many years of experience as a pastor connecting to all kinds of people, but naturally it's included people from the political circles, including congressmen and women, intelligence officers, federal and Supreme Court judges and justices, journalists, scientists, and general public servants. And importantly, these are people from both sides of the aisle, so Republicans and Democrats, right-leaning, left-leaning, everything in between. So he really models kind of a bipartisan approach to Christianity and politics, I think, which is really helpful and refreshing. His book is really short, sharp, but it's really fantastic. So you can see you can get through it in one sitting, but as I said, it's theologically sharp, it's clear, it's concise, and quite compelling, I think. And it's the sort of book that you could even give to a non-Christian if they were interested in what the Bible says about politics. The second book I want to quickly talk about is How Can I Love Church Members with Different Politics? So this book is another super short one that you can read pretty quickly in an hour or two. And it's by Jonathan Lehman and Andy Naselli. They're connected with the 9 Marks network, if you've heard of that. It's just a super practical book on ways to live in community together, despite having major differences of opinion sometimes when it comes to politics. So it came out this year, 2020, and it's very keenly and acutely aware of how toxic political divisions can be. And I found it super refreshing myself. It's very pastoral in nature, and it's just a wonderful reminder that the gospel unites us way more than politics can ever divide us. So that's a really helpful book. And then the final book I want to recommend is a book called Good and Bad Ways to Think About Religion and Politics. And for this, we're moving more into kind of the world of academia. And it looks more at the historical approaches that churches have adopted towards politics and power. It's by a guy called Robert Benny, who's an academic, a professor, and he specializes in kind of philosophy of religion stuff. And he's a Lutheran, a strong Christian with interests in ethics and religious identity and the way that Christianity connects with the wider culture and society. I personally found it really fascinating, and it's definitely one of the best books that I've read on Christianity and politics. But I understand it won't be for everyone. It can be quite dense in parts, and so for that reason, I also want to recommend an interview between Mark Dever and Robert Benny discussing the book. So that can be kind of the life hack version if you're interested, but you can't commit to buying it and reading it. Anyway, enough about the books and resources. Let's get to the questions. Thanks again for those that got in touch through the week. I've come away super encouraged and am keen to keep thinking about it together as a community. I'll also add that, just a quick disclaimer, that these questions don't necessarily have clear biblical answers, and we're moving more into the realms of trying to apply biblical wisdom to grey areas. So these will mostly be my personal opinion, which you can take or leave. You don't have to agree with me, but I hope it's helpful for thinking about some specific questions and situations that you might encounter. So with that in mind, let's get to a couple of the questions now. The first question that came in that I want to answer is in relation to how we advocate for social change. The question was, what do you think of the role of unions and format protests, i.e. strikes, rallies, writing to politicians, things of that nature, and how can we come at it from a biblical perspective in particular? So that's a great question, and my initial thought is that these things are not only permitted in the Bible, but sometimes even actively encouraged. Now, there are conditions for it. There should be peaceful and lawful ways of advocating for change and justice where possible. And I think that these sorts of examples that were mentioned in the question, so strikes, rallies, writing to politicians, those are things that are right and fair ways to participate in society as Christians and push for change, at least in our context here in Australia. Particularly when it comes to the issue of unions, passages that come to mind are James chapter 5, verses 1 to 6, which is condemning employers for exploiting their workers and failing to pay their wages. So clearly there's a justice issue in the pages of the Bible there, and that's something that unions often exist for. And there's been a lot of things that unions have done that we take for granted, I think, like the weekends, so the 5-day working week, 40-hour working weeks, and public holidays, just to name a few. Things that unions have strived for, which we have benefited greatly from. So I think that, there is a justice issue connected with it. Some other kind of passages that come up would be Ecclesiastes and Proverbs, things of that nature, which you can look at another time. But a lot of things that are related to this is that we should be pursuing justice. It comes up regularly in the Bible. It's one particularly powerful verse comes in Isaiah chapter 1, verse 17, where it says, "Learn to do right, seek justice, defend the oppressed, take up the cause of the fatherless, and plead the widow's case." So I think there are ways of advocating for change and justice that can be, one, God-honouring, but two, still respectful of those in government. You can have both those things together. So great question there. The second question that came up referred to the issue of evil governments. So I mentioned that Romans seems to presume good government, and so in that case, what about evil or bad governments? Is there a place for rebellion as Christians? And my answer to that would be yes, but it has to be in the right circumstances. One example of this is in Acts chapter 5, verse 29. Peter says that they, the apostles, they're to obey God rather than men or human beings. And this is in the context of the authorities trying to shut down the proclamation and spread of the gospel, to which the apostles just clearly say no. I think that one is a pretty big one and pretty easy and clear for Christians to understand, so no issue there. But where it gets a bit more complicated is issues of justice and mercy. So where governments are clearly failing their duty to act justly and promote social order and the common good. So those things I was talking about on Sunday from Romans 13. And one of the great historical examples to consider is Dietrich Bonhoeffer. So he was a great German theologian and pastor who famously stood up against the Nazis in World War II. And he led a resistance among churches who were being asked to surrender their independence and loyalty to the state church at the time. And this would have had massive implications. They would have ceased to really be a gospel church. They would just be this kind of state crony church that was a church in name only. So that was really important that they did that. But then the more controversial thing he did was joined in a plot to have Adolf Hitler assassinated. So he was later captured and executed when the plot failed. And while it's no doubt polarising whether assassination was the right route to kind of pursue this, whether that was the right action, it was clear that it was his Christian convictions that were leading him to do this, where he felt it was in the best interest of the German nation and the wider world to stop the monstrous genocide of the Jewish people. So that was something where it was clearly his Christian convictions that were leading him to step in, and something which I think is pretty universal. Like we can all easily condemn what the Nazis did. Like that was evil in every sense of the word. So standing up to evil in that circumstance was one thing that Dietrich Bonhoeffer looked to do in a number of ways. So in some circumstances, it's right to rebel against the government. Definitely if the preaching of the gospel is at stake, but also if the government is demonstrably and unequivocally failing in its duty to promote social order, justice, and the common good. I think that you can make a good case biblically for that. And certainly historically there have been Christians that have done that. So those are a few snapshot answers to the questions. In a different format I could give longer and more detailed answers, but I hope that's a decent starting point for anyone that's wanting to explore this stuff a bit further. Thanks again to those who contacted me through the week and passed on encouragement and feedback and questions. I really valued it. And this Sunday we'll be looking at another incredibly complex topic, the environment and climate change. So I expect there'll be plenty of questions that come up there, and I'll do my best to answer them next week too. I'm looking forward to it, and see you then. Thanks.